In 2024, one of the most important sagas in the battle for a free press came to an end. Julian Assange, the main force behind Wikileaks, was finally released from the various forms of captivity he had endured for over a decade. From hiding out in the Ecuadorian embassy for almost 7 years to imprisonment in Belmarsh prison. He had struck a deal with the Biden administration. Wikileaks is probably the most important publisher of the millennium to date. Its disclosures have helped map the operations of secret global power that was previously assumed to be unknowable. But since 2019, its leaks have slowed to a stop. Although there have been sporadic leaks from the IDF during its genocide in Gaza, none has been as vast as the Wikileaks revelations, nor as decisive in changing public opinion. Will something else play the Wikileaks role again? Wikileaks isn't the story of Julian Assange alone. It's also, of course, about the whistleblowers themselves, like Chelsea Manning, and the teams of journalists and media partners who pored over the vast trove of leaked documents in search of stories to publish. One of those people is Stefania Maurizi, an Italian journalist who has worked with Wikileaks as well as Glenn Greenwald on the Edward Snowden leaks. She's the author of Secret Power, Wikileaks and Its Enemies. My name is Richard Hames, and on this episode of Novara FM, I asked Stefania if the mistrust of the state sown by Wikileaks had mutated into conspiracy theories, whether the kinds of leaks that Wikileaks published can be replaced by open source intelligence, and whether artificial intelligence might snuff out the role of whistleblowers forever. This episode contains references to torture and sexual violence. So Stefania Maurizi, welcome to Novara FM.
Thank you for having me.
Julian Assange is free. WikiLeaks remains up. We live in an era in which leaking, although not often as big as WikiLeaks, is still normal. Has WikiLeaks won?
Well, on the one hand, he has definitely won. They took the hit. They were able to reveal and publish exceptionally important information. What WikiLeaks has published, it has entered into the history of journalism. It is not just about the scoops. It is about allowing the ordinary people to access the secrets, to discover how it works, what I call the secret power, the highest level of power. It's not conspiratorial. I avoid using, for example, deep state, because in these days, deep state is everything. It's a kind of conspiratorial thing which you don't understand. I use secret power. What is secret power? It is the highest level of power where, you can call it the military-industrial complex. A famous military leader, President Eisenhower, he was one of the most important leaders that the United States had, and he won the Nazis in Europe, so he was not a pacifist, but he warned his nation against this power which has, on which you cannot have democratic control. Is the military-industrial complex. It means the military, it means the defense industry, it means the secret services, it means the industrial complex to build weapons and so on. But in these days, it's even bigger because, for example, it includes big tech. There is no way to do wars in these days without big tech. Whether it is artificial intelligence in Gaza, using Google system, using Palantir and so on, or whether it is drones in Ukraine and data in Ukraine, there is no way to do wars to fight wars without big tech. And big tech is growing bigger and bigger inside the military-industrial complex. It is not just the defense industry, it is big tech, large parts of the diplomacy, the diplomatic body, and this power is shrouded in secrecy. That's really important to understand. The ordinary citizen has no way to know how it works because of this secrecy, and this state secrecy is not intended to protect the security and safety of citizens. Quite the opposite, is abused to protect state criminality at the highest level, to grant impunity to the state officials who commit these war crimes. And unless you know how this power operates, you have no chance to have a democratic control. I live in a country, Italy, in which we had political violence due to the strategy of tensions, due to red brigades and so on. We had these terrible massacres in the 70s. And after 60 years, the families of the victims have no chance to know what really happened. When we were revealing these WikiLeaks documents, they were contacting me and telling me, could you please check? Could you please check whether there is anything about our case? Because even after decades of criminal investigations, judges, prosecutors, police doing investigation, they don't know who was responsible for this and who ordered these massacres. But for the first time in history, WikiLeaks ripped a gaping hole and gave billions of people access to information how this power works. So it goes beyond scoops. It goes beyond revealing secret documents, because secret documents had been revealed by reporters working on national security matters for decades. But what is the WikiLeaks revolution is giving access to billions of people to millions of documents, secret documents on how this power works. And this is the revolution. Before them, we were kind of, we were kind of thinking there is no way to know. State secrecy, there's no way to challenge it, But they allowed understanding that the fight against secrecy, the battle against secrecy can be won. And they did. They did.
I think people are pretty clear that there is such a secret power that sort of exists outside of and separate from democratic norms. And I wonder if that's been historically changing. Britain has its first official Secrets Act in 1889. It's over 130 years ago now. But there is a sort of a broad dynamic of liberalization over the course of the 20th century. Countries becoming more liberal, becoming more open. Tony Blair signed into government the Freedom of Information Act, which allows people to access requests. I know that you're yourself using that act in various ways to do your own journalism. Isn't there also, at the same time as this secret power, a broader tendency in history towards greater governmental openness? Or is that me being sort of naive and hopeful?
Before WikiLeaks, we had this concept that you cannot win state secrecy. Maybe you can get tiny bit of information, but maybe you can get a whistleblower, maybe you can get some secret documents, but you cannot really win this battle against state secrecy. Ordinary people didn't realize the importance of this level of power for their ordinary lives. Maybe they were thinking, I'm a teacher in London, I'm a hairdresser in Bath, I'm an ordinary citizen. Why I should care about this level of power? My life will never intersect with this highest level of power. But it is when you see the documentation that you realize that they do have an impact on your life. They decide, for example, if we have to spend 20 years in Afghanistan and we don't have the money for schools, for pensions, for health, for our health systems, they decide our lives. We don't perceive it because we don't understand, we don't have the factual information about this level of power. Now you can think that actually there is no need for WikiLeaks because many things have changed, and you think that we have tools like freedom of information. But at the end of the day, freedom of information, while extremely valuable, and I have been fighting for the last 9 years to get access to the documentation of WikiLeaks using FOI litigation in Britain, in the US, in Australia, in Sweden. So I have been fighting using Freedom of Information Act, But at the same time, you don't have any chance to get this kind of information using freedom of information, using open source, things like that, because these are top secret information. So unless some insider, unless some whistleblower steps out and provide you access to this documentation, you have no chance. Let me give you an example. The collateral murder video, which made WikiLeaks famous around the world.
Just tell us what's in that video, because it's very famous, but people will need their memory jogging.
It is this video about a US military helicopter, an Apache helicopter is called, killing innocent civilian in Baghdad during the Iraq war. And while the crew was laughing openly, and the US military had publicly thought that those were fighters. It was a military action against fighters, but at the end of the day, those were not fighters, those were civilians, including 2 journalists, 2 war photographer for the Reuters and his assistant, basically. They were no threat to the US forces. So they were massacred while the crew was laughing openly, And this video was made WikiLeaks famous around the world. And the Reuters, since the Reuters had 2 journalists killed in that attack by the Apache helicopter, had tried to get a copy of this video using the Freedom of Information Act, but there was no chance whatsoever. So the Freedom of Information Act is an extremely valuable tool. It is really important to have such tool, but you cannot get this kind of information about the secret power using the Freedom of Information Act. So, it is about fighting to get access to the highest level of power, and WikiLeaks made this possible, had the courage to fight and had the courage to publish, because it is not enough to have a source. Chelsea Manning, she had the courage to reveal the documentations about collateral murder video, the documents about the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the documents about the conversation, the correspondence by the US diplomacies, the documents about Guantanamo, 700,000 secret documents, US secret documents. She had been extraordinary. But it is not enough to have a hero like Chelsea Manning. You need to have journalists, a media organization like WikiLeaks, which has the courage to publish.
Let's think about the kind of history of that secret power, because it's not undifferentiated, it's not always the same, there's big changes. Where do you see the sort of the crucial moments, perhaps through the 20th century, but particularly I'm thinking in the post-Cold War era? What are the big changes in the way in which that secret power is organized?
In the past, this power was kind of authoritarian, openly authoritarian, and it didn't appeal to values like freedom, democracy, and human rights. Whereas in these days, this power operates using values which are widely appreciated and supported by the liberal, and progressive part of our society. So they don't tell people we go to Afghanistan to do wars to get their resources and to get and so on. We go there to fight for the women, for human rights. We go there to fight for an open society, a democratic one. And so the propaganda around this secret power has become very clever, and basically people do not perceive the atrocities Do not see the ugly face, the brutal face of this power. Whereas in the past, this brutal face was widely known, War was war. War means killing people. War means atrocities. Wars means war crimes, torture. Whereas in these days, there is a massive propaganda around this power. Those who are anti-war, anti-torture, and so on, they have been not so clever to understand how they have massively used our values, the values of human rights, women rights, freedom, democracy, to sell wars, to sell invasions.
One of the kind of parts of that history that people often, I think, like to point to in terms of thinking about transparency is the rise of the internet. And it was often predicted from the very early days, I'm thinking mid 1990s, that the internet would bring about a sort of new era of freedom and a new era of transparency. That doesn't really happen until the sort of late noughties, right? So it doesn't happen until then. How do you account for that? Like, what is missing apart from WikiLeaks as a publisher? Apart from that, like, why do you think that the internet didn't seemingly bring about like enormous transformations in transparency? Or do you think that maybe it did, and we can attribute something like the Arab Spring to that process?
Well, I think the digital era greatly contributed to make this revolution possible. And that's why the secret power is really upset. They realize that it is very difficult to keep secrets in a digital age. It's really difficult. In these days, you can get maybe 100,000 secret documents from the Pentagon networks. You can put them in a USB stick and leak to a media organization. It was not possible before. In 1971, we had this famous, another hero of mine, Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked 7,000 pages of the so-called Pentagon Papers, revealing the truth about the war in Vietnam. But it had been tremendously hard to photocopy 7,000 pages of documents and to bring them out and to hand them over to the journalists. It's very difficult to keep the secrets. I mean, the Pentagon lost control of them. The CIA lost control of them. The NSA lost control of them. The Pentagon lost control of the Afghan and Iraq war logs with WikiLeaks. The CIA lost control of the documentation on their cyber weapons, Vault 7, published by WikiLeaks. The NSA lost control of the secret with Edward Snowden. So the US intelligence community has funding for at least $100 billion. How many intelligence agencies can afford such funding? Very few of them, and they want to set a precedent. They want to send a message. If you leak and publish these documents, your life will be destroyed. That's why they crushed Julian, and Julian Assange his life had been devastated. They took the best years of his life, between 39 and 53 are the best years of one's life, the most productive, and they took them. Now he's free, of course, but they took them. There's no chance he will get those years back.
We'll get into the kind of way in which they took them and the kind of the tensions and difficulties around that. I think you're right. There is this technical change that happens with USB sticks, right? And the ability to simply move large amounts of files around very quickly and very easily and very secretly, of course. But there's also, I want to suggest, a sort of a ideological change that happens in the early years of the internet as well. And that libertarianism that comes to define Julian Assange's politics is sort of grown there and sort of stimulated there. Can you talk to that early political development? Like, how do you see the importance of those ideas in Julian Assange's life?
He grew up in this cypherpunk group, and in the 90s, those they were mainly focused, this group of people who had, they were very interested in the impact of technology in our everyday life and on the impact on our freedoms, on our civil liberties, and so on. And they were very, they were very deeply focused on technology, on the impact of technology, well before society was concerned about technology and very focused on technology. So they were pioneers about the impact of technologies on our life. On the one hand, many of them were libertarians, many of them. Some of them extreme libertarians, like Tim May, for example, who wanted no intervention whatsoever by the state on anything, on the economy and so on.
So is Tim May the guy who comes up with assassination markets?
Yeah,
I forget.
It's unclear to me who proposed this dystopian idea, but if we don't explain the context, it seems like really wild. Actually, they were exploring the possibility of anonymous communications and the possibility of ordering killings in a totally anonymous form, so that you could not discover the killers and who had ordered the killing, and you could not trace the money. You could not follow the money between the person who had ordered the killing and the person who had committed the killing, because of crypto market, cryptocurrency. But it was mainly an intellectual exploration of how technology could get very dystopian, very dystopian, of course. But if you ask me about Julian's political vision, it was definitely not the vision of other cypherpunk on the extreme libertarian, especially socially. He is not a guy who doesn't want doesn't want any kind of state control of on economy. He's libertarian when it comes to communications, to digital rights, absolutely, but not when it comes to the to the economy. You should read what he says about the unions, for example. He is not anti-union like many libertarians are, for example.
Yeah, he's a sort of classic left libertarian, I would say. So he describes left libertarianism, or the left rather, as sort of groupist ideology, and he says, "I'm not a groupist." Sort of rejects those kind of collective identities. But I would say he's more left than he is sort of classic right libertarian. I do want to go back into this sort of thing about what makes WikiLeaks possible. So a whole bunch of things, sort of technical achievements, change. So we talked about USB sticks, which are very mundane, but actually incredibly important for this story. Tell us about things like PGP or Jabber Chat or Tor or Matrix, or like tools that I know nothing about, right? How do these various kinds of things like Tails or air-gapped computers, the tools in the toolbox of the journalist doing sort of secure communications, how do they work and how do they facilitate what it is that WikiLeaks eventually does?
There is no doubt whatsoever that technology played an exceptional important role in the rise of WikiLeaks and the WikiLeaks revolution, because and the first time I realized this was back in 2008, when I had not started working as a media partner with WikiLeaks for my newspaper. At that time, I was looking at their work, basically, without knowing them. And I was deeply impressed because, for example, they had published the Guantanamo manual about the military task force operating Guantanamo, And I was wondering, how did they get it? Because, many journalists had tried to get this document, these secret documents, and they had been unable to get it. And so I was wondering how they did it. But I realized that cryptography had a crucial role, because from the darkness of state secrecy, There, whistleblowers stepped out in order to leak these documents precisely because they had a tool to leak anonymously. And that was made possible by cryptography, by the technological choices behind WikiLeaks. Because if a source wanted to leak it using telephone or email, the old-fashioned, techniques we use as journalists, they would have been immediately identified. So what is really important is how technology has made this possible. Some technological tools which allowed sources to leak anonymously and to be rather sure that they would never be identified. And you have to realize in those days, it was after 9/11. There was a lot of conformism. Many reporters were reporting whatever the secret services, whatever the Pentagon, whatever the CIA were telling to the journalists, because it was the effect on 9/11. People were scared, people were terrified, and so on. But you have to realize that the atrocities, the human rights abuses, the violence, the torture that the Bush administration had been involved in made a lot of dissidents, even inside the Secret Service, even inside the US intelligence community. There were people which were probably not on the left. They were not probably, the best supporters of human rights, but they, at the end of the day, they disagree with such methods. They disagree with such atrocities. They disagree with waterboarding. They disagreed with this extreme torture. So if they had a chance to leak this documentation without being identified, they did. They would do it. And they did, actually. Let's not do the mistake of thinking that technology is everything. It is not. It is not. You can have the best technology, but if you don't have the courage to publish, technology is nothing. So, for example, when they published the documentation on the Guantanamo manual, when they published it, the Pentagon immediately contacted WikiLeaks asking to remove the documents from their website. And they said, no, we won't remove it. So this is not about technologies. This is about courage. The courage of Chelsea Manning of leaking, the courage of Julian Assange and the WikiLeaks journalists of publishing.
I totally agree. Of course, it's about courage, and you need that. But I would also like to sort of be able to talk through some of those technologies. So Tails is a sort of an operating system on a USB stick, right? You put it in the computer and you boot up a computer that's just on that USB stick, and then it vanishes from the computer you're running it on. Tell us about rubber hose cryptography, because that's actually an Assange invention itself.
We can talk about PGP. PGP is the very, very first software to encrypt emails. In 1991, it is when Julian Assange and the cypherpunk were discussing the consequence and the impact of encryption on society, on politics, on social changes, and so on. The biggest public debate was about PGP, which had been introduced a few years before, and the engineer who had the software engineer who had introduced it had been put under investigation by the US government because it was considered a military tool to encrypt communications, and so the state won the monopoly on the secure communication between individuals. The state wanted to be in control of communications and secure communications. So PGP was the first tool and unleashed a public debate on the right of citizens to communicate privately. So PGP had an important role. And of course, after PGP, other kinds of encryption tools played it. Tor, for anonymous surfing on the web has been very, very important. And, Julian Assange, when he was very young, tried to introduce this kind of software called rubber hose, so that if you were stopped, arrested by the police, you had a way to conceal data in a kind of false bottom, digital false bottom, which allowed you to hide this data. Had it not for the digital age, a massive leak like Afghan war logs, Iraq war logs, the US diplomatic cables would have been impossible.
Let's go to those leaks now. So the first one, of course, is the Afghan war leaks, which is released in July 2010. These tranches of leaks were really quite shocking at the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the first time, I remember how emotional I was when I got access to this 10,000 documents, secret reports by the soldiers, by the US soldiers on the war theater. And for the first time, you could get access to this information, not 30 years after the war had finished, but as the war was ongoing. So for the first time, we could see what was going on the war theater, on the entire war theater, not just on this area, that area, and so on, as the war was going on. And never before it had been possible to get access to this deluge of information as the war was ongoing. The only exception was in 1971 when Daniel Ellsberg leaked these 7,000 top secret pages on the war in Vietnam. So it took 40 years before there was a new massive leak about a war as the war was ongoing. I remember I was very emotional because for the first time we could compare what the propaganda machine was telling us and what was actually happening on the war theater. We could discover these secret units like Task Force 373, which we had never heard before. So we could understand that these people had no idea who they were killing, for example. A lot of resentment by the local population because these people were killing at will without any idea about what they were killing in the middle of the night. A lot of resentment, a lot of protests, and we could even learn about the crimes of the Taliban. For example, their use of improvised explosive device, have data about the crimes of the Taliban, because these documents are not just about the crimes of US troops or Western troops, even about the crimes of the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and so on.
How would you characterize the way in which that war differed from the war in Iraq? I mean, obviously, Afghanistan is a very different country. It's a much less urbanized country. It's much more fighting in the plains. It's much more fighting in mountains than it is in Iraq, which is much more about cities. How would you characterize the sort of differences in the way in which the US prosecuted that war at the level of intelligence or at the level of the secret services?
In the case of Afghanistan, we clearly got a picture, well-documented picture of how little we got after 10 years. Because these documents were going back to the last 6 years. And we could realize that they had obtained very, very little in this war, which is what we realized when the US troops withdrew from Afghanistan. But that was in the documentation already. Back in 2010, we could understand very clearly that we had obtained very little. And we were losing the war. We were obtaining very, very little with a lot of victims. So many victims, civilian victims, and we should have listened to what this documentation were revealing, that the war had no serious chance to be won, and we were killing thousands of civilians. This documentation is also important because it's one of the very few official sources for trying to reconstruct how many civilian victims there were. Before 2007, if you ask, for example, to the UN mission in Afghanistan, they have no data about the civilian victims between 2001 and 2007. There are no officials, no official statistics. So this documentation is one of the I think is the only one actually, is the only public source available to try to reconstruct the numbers of civilian victims. As for Iraq, the Iraq war logs are terrible. They are full of atrocities, and you are to be able to deal with such atrocities. You can read hour, half an hour, by the hours, and every day what was happening on the war theater, and you could see the atrocities. You could see, another hopeless war made possible by lies. It was. These are extremely important documents, and to these days, researchers, scholars keep using them. Keep using this documentation.
Perhaps the most controversial massacre carried out by US forces in Iraq is the Nisour Square massacre. But it wasn't actually carried out by the US Army. It was carried out by Blackwater, this kind of private intelligence agency. This kind of private army, basically, run by this guy, Eric Prince, who we talked about in a previous episode with James Pogue. I'm wondering if you can sort of talk to us about how you see those three things fitting together. So on the one hand, we have intelligence agencies like the CIA. On the other hand, we have the US Army that is, of course, in country with lots of people. And then we have these kind of private military contractors, right? What role are they playing in the Iraq war? And what role are they playing in Afghanistan? And how do they fit into this sort of secret power? Because they are actually not government agencies, right? They're not like kind of, they're not officially behind the sort of secrecy curtain, but they nevertheless are in practice. So I was wondering if you could talk to us about the role that they play in this overall system.
You have these Blackwater mercenaries, because these are what they are, and they were killing at will. Basically, they were doing massacres, and at the end of the day, President Trump pardoned them. They pardoned President Trump during the first presidential mandate, pardoned them, whereas President Trump refused to pardon Julian Assange, Edward Snowden. So I think this is the most important thing we have to think about. How dystopian our society has become, where the war criminals have been pardoned and they are free as the air, and those who had the courage and conscience to reveal these war crimes had been crushed, had their lives destroyed. Chelsea Manning tried to commit suicide three times. Edward Snowden lives in exile. Julian Assange had his life devastated by this arbitrary detention in Belmarsh, and so this is the most important thing we should focus. We have a lot of journalistic work about Blackwater, especially by the US investigative reporter Jeremy Scahill, which I strongly recommend, of course. So their role on the war theater is well known thanks to this investigative work. What is less known? Our society, which we think is liberal, he's decent, he's committed to human rights, actually protect these war criminals. And at the end of the day, they got presidential pardon, whereas those who had the courage to reveal their crimes had their lives devastated. We should have a major and public debate about this, because the way these people are protected is not just about secrecy. They are not just protected by secrecy. They are not just protected by powerful people. They are protected by society in general. Justice cannot be that these people get presidential pardon, whereas Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning have been, have been massacred.
I wonder if we can go to that Chelsea Manning story now. So she breaks out information out of the US government. Talk to us about that, because the details of it become somewhat controversial in Julian Assange's case. So this question about whether or not he helped her break a password. Can you talk to us about that process? Like, materially, what did Chelsea Manning do to release that information?
So Chelsea Manning was an intelligence analyst who basically had access to tens of thousands, millions of documents, secret documents, because of their profession, because she was supposed to read and analyze this information for the US Army. She was in Iraq during the Iraq War, and she could have just looked the other side when reading about these massacres, when watching the collateral murder images. She could have just thought, well, there is only one life. You only live once. Why to put your life at risk? Why spending your life in a prison? Why risking the death penalty? Because in some circumstances, you can even get death penalty sentence, depending whether the U.S. Justice Department think that you are helping the enemy, aiding the enemy by leaking these secret documents. And if the prosecutors establish that you are aiding the enemy, you get that penalty. So she risked her neck. She could have just ignored it, look the other side, and she could have just thought about her career, her future, but she did not. She took the most difficult, the most problematic, in a sense, decision of leaking this, getting this information in the public domain by leaking it to Julian Assange of Wikileaks. From the very beginning, the US authorities tried to represent her like in a kind of conspiracy with Julian Assange. They were trying to argue that she had not just leaked the information, but she had cooperated with Julian Assange to hack the US military computers. But this has never been proved. And at the end of the day, if you read the plea deal signed by Julian Assange, there is no mention whatsoever. I mean, if that was the case, they would have pursued, they would have charged Julian, not just charged Julian, but they would have asked him to plead guilty for computer intrusion, for conspiring in computer intrusion, in accessing these computers. They didn't. So at the end of the day, that was just a tactic to try to represent Julian as not a journalist, but kind of hacker, kind of cyber criminal, who didn't confine himself to receive this information through WikiLeaks, but he had actively hacked this information. And if they were able to provide evidence of this, of course, he would have been sentenced as a cyber criminal. But this has never been proved. As a matter of fact, they gave up in their plea deal agreement, in their final plea deal with Julian Assange. They do not mention it at all, So it was just a tactic to go around the journalistic protection, because they knew it was very difficult to get a sentence considering the journalistic protection, because what Julian did, what WikiLeaks did, is precisely what we do. We receive important information from a source and we publish it. We verified it and we published,
The cowardice of much of the media in the issue of leaking has been quite staggering. The Washington Post, whose credibility benefited enormously from the leaking of Edward Snowden, went on to publish an editorial arguing against a presidential pardon for him. We urgently need journalism that can hold power to account. Novara Media is committed to doing that, but we need your help. That's why, yes, you guessed it, we're asking for an hour's wage a month or whatever you can afford, so that we can keep covering the stories that the powerful want buried, like here on NovaraFM, where we recently released an in-depth report about how the British state tried to crush the Palestine movement. And now back to the show. Is there a sort of question there about the limits of journalistic practice? Because it does seem to me like that kind of act, whether or not Julian Assange did it, what do you think about that as a kind of legitimate extension of journalistic practice? Do you think that should be normalized? Do you think that journalists might sometimes need to hack into computer systems?
You cannot have journalism, good journalism, without being aggressive, without being, without disturbing the power, the powerful. And we can make this kind of aggressive journalism thanks to our sources. I don't think we should go into the field of being hacker, in a sense, of being, compromising data sets, if you ask me. But we certainly have to take the heat and to take the legal consequences of publishing leaked information. I remember at the beginning, there were concerned about the legal aspect of publishing this leaked information. I never had doubt. I absolutely wanted to publish it, no matter the consequences, because what these documents reveal is tremendously important. These are among the most important scoops in the history of journalism, and so you cannot confine yourself and say, this information maybe comes from a source who was supposed to stick to the state secrecy. Sure, of course, but she took a decision, an ethical decision, and she decided to take the heat and to leak it. And she did the right thing.
Speaking of trusting sources, regardless of the provenance of their information, in August 2010, Julian Assange received a summons for questioning for suspected rape of a lesser degree, unlawful coercion, multiple cases of sexual molestation in August 2010 in Sweden. Tell us about those allegations, because in your book, I have to say, I think you treat them relatively lightly, that you don't seem to regard them as having much weight. And that's not the way in which I think they were presented at the time. I think it's probably not the way we should present them. Tell us about that decision to regard those allegations as sort of dubious.
Yeah, I mean, but in August 2010, basically, Julian Assange traveled to Sweden. He had been invited by an organization there to give a conference about the documents on the Afghan war. They had been published 4 weeks, not even 4 weeks before. So it was very fresh information in the public domain. And basically he ended up in a nightmare, in a legal nightmare, about these two women who had wanted to go to basically one of them accused Julian of not using condom during their sexual intercourse.
Despite the fact that she had asked him to. That does qualify as sexual molestation under Swedish law, doesn't it?
Well, according to the investigation was about sexual molestation, about having a sexual intercourse without using condom at the request of the partner. You know, that was the allegation. I'm not saying I was not there, so I have to basically reconstruct based on the police reports, on the questioning, and on the witnesses. You know. So basically, the first allegations were for sexual molestation and rape. And the rape was minor rape. the less serious crime, what is called less serious crime in Sweden. It's called less serious crime. And the allegation was that he had sexual intercourse with this woman, Sofia, who basically was kind of sleeping. And so even if she had consented to have sexual intercourse before, when they had sexual intercourse, at that moment, according to the allegations, she was sleeping. So she was unable to provide a consent, considering she was sleeping. And Julian Assange was not wearing a condom in that specific episode, in that specific sexual intercourse. So according to the Swedish law, this could be minor rape. So it is a kind of crime, kind of allegations in which there is consent. It is not that you never got consent, but the moment you have sexual intercourse, you are not able to give your consent because you are sleeping. So basically, on the 20th of August 2010, this investigation was opened as sexual molestation and rape, and the arrest of Julian Assange was ordered. But the day after, basically, the arrest was cancelled, and 5 days after, the rape investigation was closed because the chief prosecutor, the Stockholm chief prosecutors, Eva Finne, thought there was no crime. His behavior in this case, in the case of Sofia, revealed no crime at all. So the only investigation which the chief prosecutors in Stockholm wanted to bring ahead was the sexual molestation episode. And Julian Assange was questioned by the Swedish police on the sexual molestation allegations. It was questioned on the 30th of August 2010, and he even volunteered some information about the rape case, but the police told him, no, the rape case is closed. So we should focus only on sexual molestation because the rape case is closed. And so on the 30th of August, he was questioned about the sexual molestation, and he answered all questions asked by the Swedish police. But 2 days later, on the 1st of September 2010, a different prosecutor reopened the rape case. And this prosecutor, Marianne Ny, kept it open for 7 years. She kept open this investigation for rape and sexual molestation until May 2017. She waited for 6 years. Just in November 2016, she decided to go to London to question Julian Assange. And after questioning him, she closed the investigation in May 2017. So the matter is, why a prosecutor who has, if she thinks she has enough evidence to keep the preliminary investigation open, why does she keep it open without questioning him? Because he had been willing to be questioned from the very beginning. Actually, he had been questioned on the sexual molestation episode back in August 2010. So why not to question him? He was willing to be questioned even before taking refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy. He had been willing to be questioned via video link on the phone in the embassy in London. So all these options are legally permissible, legally fine for the Swedish law. So the Swedish prosecutor could have questioned him anytime, even when he took refuge in the embassy after he had exhausted all options to oppose his extradition to Sweden, because, the Swedish prosecutors wanted to extradite him just for questioning, not because they had charges, not because he was supposed to stand on trial. No, just for questioning. And he was refusing to go to Stockholm just for questioning because he had reasonable ground to think that he could be extradited to the US immediately. I reported the advice that which was given to Julian Assange by his prominent lawyer. His prominent lawyer is Michael Ratner. He died in 2016, and he's the lawyer who made possible the basically the a legal representation for the Guantanamo detainees. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for them to have a lawyer, to go before a judge, and so on. So he was a prominent lawyer. And if you read his book of memories, basically, and the legal advice to Julian Assange was, don't go to Sweden. Be questioned in London, because if you go to Sweden, the US would extradite you and charge you with espionage Espionage Act violations, which is what happened in 2019, basically.
When he was arrested as he came out of the embassy.
Yeah, he had understood everything. He gave this advice to Julian Assange in 2010. So 9 years before he was charged with Espionage Act violations. But the problem is that the Swedish prosecutors didn't want to come here in London to question Julian. And no one understood why. Why not? I mean, it was legally fine. It was a very, a very common practice to rely on mutual legal assistance between states. So why not? And it took my FOI litigation to establish why not? Why the Swedish prosecutors didn't want to go to London to question Julian.
And why not?
By deciding of not going to London to question Julian, they put Julian in limbo, where he was not charged, he was not questioned, he was not charged, but at the same time, the investigation was not closed. So he was kept in limbo, where he was blamed, he was attacked as a rapist without ever being charged, without ever being, questioned about the rape case. So he was put in limbo for 7 years. 7 years when at the end of the day, the Swedish prosecutors closed the investigation, dropped the investigation. So why not? Why didn't want to go there? And the reason is that the British authorities at the Crown Prosecution Service had told them, don't question Julian Assange in London, question him only after extraditing him in Sweden. And this advice by the UK authorities at the Crown Prosecution Service basically contributed to create this legal quagmire, legal and diplomatic, because when he exhausted any chance to challenge the extradition legally into the British courts, so the first instance, appeal court, Supreme Court, and when he lost all these cases, and he lost all these cases because there is no way to challenge the European arrest warrant, because the European arrest warrant is a tool created after the 9/11 to make extradition very quick, very easy, so that there are no problems with in trying to extradite alleged terrorists. So when he lost all this case, his fight against extradition, he took refuge in the Swedish embassy to get protection from...
The Ecuadorian embassy.
In the Ecuadorian embassy, to get protection from Ecuador, And at that point, the legal quagmire became also a diplomatic quagmire, a legal and diplomatic quagmire. And this quagmire kept Julian Assange, trapped in London for 9 years until he was arrested. So it was the UK authorities at the Crown Prosecution Service who contributed to create this quagmire. And since when I discovered this in 2015, only thanks to my FOI battle. And since then, I have been fighting for the last 9 years to try to understand why they provide this advice, because it made no sense. It made no sense. The British authorities had the whole interest to go ahead very quickly, to get Julian questioned in London very quickly, charge or drop the case. They had no interest in having this legal and diplomatic nightmare, basically. And all my attempts to shed light on this have failed so far. So it came out that the UK authorities destroyed the document, the Swedish authorities destroyed the document. So there is after 9 years, I've been trying to shed light on this. On the behavior of the Swedish and the UK, British authorities, and I experienced a tremendous pushback,
Yeah, I think obviously this is one of the classic limits of the freedom of information request is that they can essentially stonewall you, prevent you from getting any further with that, more or less without limits. One of the very few limits that the British government does respect, however, is, of course, the inviolability of embassies. For example, the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where Julian Assange lives for about 7 years. Tell us about conditions in the embassy. What was he doing there? What was it like to live there in a single room with almost no privacy? And what kinds of tools were the British government trying to use to surveil him while he was there?
Yeah, I mean, I was there, so I can say what I have seen. It is very disturbing, I have to say. And each time I was visiting him in the embassy, in the Ecuadorian embassy, I was thinking, how can he survive like that? Because I would get mad in 7 months, not in 7 years inside the embassy. I mean, it was when we tell, it was an embassy. One thing about a fantastic palace, a building with a garden and so on, but that was a modest flat in the heart of London, and there was no garden, nothing. So he was confined in this room 24 hours a day. He had no chance whatsoever to get fresh air. He could not go out and enjoy fresh air, sunlight, and things like that. And he could not even go to the hospital when he needed it. So imagine this situation. Imagine living in these conditions for almost 7 years. Imagine what does it mean. I mean, it's terrible. It was terrible. We have seen his health collapsing, and we could see this process little by little every day, and it was extremely sad. And there was no way out. We were reporting on the terrible condition as journalists. We were telling he was dying slowly, but nothing changed. He tried to appeal to the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, and he won. The UN Arbitrary Detention established that he was arbitrarily detained since 2010. But nothing happened. Britain was ridiculing the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, and Sweden was ignoring it, and no one did anything. We were reporting on the scandal, and nothing happened. Then he tried with all international human bodies, but nothing and no one could make his life, could solve this situation, could fix this. So at the end of the day, it was extremely disturbing to see what happened, how a journalist can remain arbitrarily detained with no access to sunlight, no access to fresh air, no access to medical treatment, and nothing happened. This didn't happen in North Korea, didn't happen in Russia, didn't happen in China. This happened in London, in a country which glorifies journalism, which glorifies media freedom. And that's why I put so much energies, both in my FOI battle, but also in my book to reconstruct the story in an extremely objective, documented way, so that people cannot say it didn't happen. We work in a way that this will not happen again. Because clearly there will be another Chelsea Manning. There will be another collateral murder video. I'm sure there will be.
Earlier, I said that the UK government respects the inviolability of embassies, which is this legal principle, which is that embassies are the national terrain of their countries and therefore they can't be violated. That was somewhat tongue-in-cheek because there were ways that they were surveilling Julian Assange inside the Ecuadorian embassy. We could talk particularly about tags on windows, which is this kind of almost sci-fi thing where you basically put something on the outside of the window and then you can see how the window is vibrating. You can see like tiny little vibrations, and that will allow you to hear the voices of people inside indirectly. Extraordinary. But also there are two security companies that are involved inside them, which you detail in the book. UC Global, Prom Security. Can you tell us about what those groups are and what connections they might have had to states other than the Ecuadorian state?
So the Ecuadorian embassy is a tiny building, is a flat in the heart of London. And at the very beginning, they had no serious protection, the kind of security protection you expect for an embassy. So they realized when Julian took refuge in the embassy on June 2012, when Julian took refuge in the embassy, they realized they needed some kind of security protection because they had not even a protection from intrusion, physical intrusion in the embassy. So they hired a security company, which was a Spanish one, called UC Global. And this security company was a company which was trusted by the Ecuadorian embassy to an extent that she was providing security to the family of the Ecuadorian president, Rafael Correa, at the time. So it appeared a kind of arrangement which made sense, of course, to have this security company working to protect the embassy. But what really happened, of course, we could expect surveillance. We could see all these vans, police vans, metropolitan police vans. We could see the building heavily guarded by the Scotland Yard agents. They spent something like 13 million pounds to have this physical presence of Scotland Yard agents. So we could see them. But what we could not imagine was that apparently this UC Global company had started working for the CIA. And there is an ongoing investigation in Spain, a criminal investigation in Spain, which has been going on since 2019. And so we hope sooner or later we will have some kind of, indictment, a trial, and so on. And what came out is extremely disturbing. It is extremely disturbing that this company basically had been enrolled by the US intelligence, by the CIA, to collect everything about Julian Assange, about his family, his wife, Stella, their first child, Gabriel, and about all of us, about the Wikileaks journalists, the doctors, the lawyers, especially the lawyers. Unless you have confidentiality of communications between lawyers and clients, you don't have a serious chance to get a legal protection. If the government can access the legal advice, your communication with your lawyer, they can discover your legal strategy. So you have no serious legal protection, and they got access to everything. Even if Julian was extremely conscious about, he was convinced he was under heavy surveillance, he was spied, and he had tried to get all sorts of arrangement in order to protect the confidentiality of his communication with his lawyers, his doctors, his journalists at WikiLeaks, and even us. I remember we were trying to communicate in a confidential way, because as media partner working on these secret documents, we had to be able to discuss it in a confidential manner. But I remember when I discovered that my phone had been open in two and the SIM card extracted. And the only reason why I discovered this is because this company took pictures of my phone opening too and the SIM extracted. So we had evidence when the police sees these pictures and videos and audio files and so on. We got access to this documentation, and we discovered the full extent of this. Let me tell you, since I started working on these files, my communication experienced a lot of disruption. Email got lost, phone got lost, text messages got lost, but no one was believing me. No one believed me. The last time I met Julian before he was arrested, it was 5 months before he was arrested. It was November 2018. I went to the embassy and Julian was in a terrible shape with his long hairs, and he had lost a lot of weight. It was terrible. He was very lucid, but in such a physical bad shape that I wrote my editors at La Repubblica. At that time, I was working for the major Italian daily newspaper, La Repubblica. And I wrote my deputy editor at La Repubblica, he's dying. I don't know how he can still be lucid, but he's dying slowly. And I was waiting to hear from my editor, my deputy editor at La Repubblica, and I received no feedback from him. So after 2 days, I had visited Julian Assange. The deputy editor of La Repubblica sent me a message. Stefania, we have been trying to reach you for the last 2 days. We sent text messages. We tried to call you. We sent emails. Why you are not replying? And I told him, I have nothing on my phone, nothing on my inbox. I never received anything. So I had been isolated, totally isolated. No one believed me until the picture of my phone opening two were publicly, So we discovered these extremely disturbing spying activities against Julian Assange, against his wife Stella, against their child. They were planning to steal the napkin of Gabriel in order to establish whether Julian was his father.
By doing a DNA test or something.
Exactly. So we had this kind of extremely disturbing picture of what was going on behind the scene in the embassy. And we discovered, thanks to the two protected witnesses, that the company had discussed killing Julian with the US intelligence. They were planning either to poison him or to kidnap him, and this was confirmed later on by an investigation by Yahoo News. So all these extremely disturbing things we discovered that were going on, and we discovered this only thanks to these protected witnesses, and thanks to the fact that the Spanish police seize this material. I think you expect this kind of things in authoritarian states. You know that authoritarian states operate like this. They try to kill journalists. They spy on journalists systematically. They try to do this kind of things. But you don't expect this in our democratic society.
I think I want to push back on that slightly, because I feel like I do expect it. And that's not just because I read about this stuff a lot, and I've read your book and a whole bunch of other accounts of this thing, but also because I think that there is a generational shift in trust of the state.
I agree.
And I want to get into what you think of as the kinds of impact, the long-running impact of those WikiLeaks disclosures, and then the Snowden leaks, which come out while Assange is in the embassy in 2013. How do we understand the kind of the broad evaporation of trust in the state that I think has taken place over the last 10 years. Do you see that?
I absolutely agree with you. There is there is no trust in the state. You cannot trust these people. You cannot trust you. Let me give you an example. So, for example, I'm very proud of my country because we are the only country in the world which was able to nail the CIA agents involved, responsible for the CIA extraordinary rendition of a cleric in Milan in the middle of the day, like Pinochet. In the middle of the day, this guy disappeared, and the prosecutors who were investigating him for alleged terrorism had their guy disappear into thin air, basically. And it came out that it was a CIA rendition, extraordinary rendition, where the CIA was basically kidnapping people, bringing them in some states like Egypt and so on. They were torturing them brutally to get information. So basically, we were the only country to nail the CIA agents involved, responsible for this rendition. Our prosecutors were so brilliant, so efficient that they charged them, they identified them, they put them under investigation, charged them, brought them on trial in absentia. They left Italy, they were in the US, but in Italy you can put a person on trial in absentia. We were very proud. We got final sentence. They were convicted, and we are the only country in the world which convicted the US CIA agents. However, none of them spent one day, a week in prison. None of them. They were granted impunity. Why so? Because the US authorities put pressure not on the prosecutors, not on the judges, because they knew they are independent. They put pressures on Italian politicians. They knew that our politicians are, in most cases, they are servants of the US authorities. So they were able to have our politicians refusing to extradite the US CIA agents. Extradition is a political process,
Rather than a juridical one.
You can work in a way that you don't extradite these people. So at the end of the day, even if we were the only country in the world which, got a final sentence for the CIA agents, 26 of them, all of them, these people were granted impunity. And at the end of the day, we were sentenced by the European Court of Human Rights for granting impunity to the CIA, which is a paradox, which is absurd. The only country in the world which sentenced them got sentenced by the European Court of Human Rights. All this was public because of the criminal investigation in Italy, and an extremely important criminal investigation. We had journalists traveling to Italy from US, from Germany, from countries around the world to report about this case. However, what it was not known, it was the pressure on Italian politicians, all of them, from the right to the left, and their conversation with the US authorities, with the US diplomats. Of course, we could imagine this kind of pressure. We could have imagined that the US had put pressure on them, but it is one thing to imagine, it is another thing to get evidence. We got evidence thanks to the Wikileaks cables. When you read these cables, you lose any trust in your state, because you see how they were willing to sell us to the US authorities, to the CIA. If there is anything that make a difference between a democracy and an authoritarian state, is the fact that you cannot disappear in the middle of the day. You cannot do it. In an authoritarian state, you expect that you can disappear anytime, in the middle of the night or in the middle of the day. But in a democracy, it must not be. It cannot happen. It should not happen at all. Absolutely. This is how your trust as a citizen, not just as a journalist, but as a citizen in the state, disappear completely. You cannot trust.
So let's look at, for example, America as well, because the cultural dynamics there are quite different, I think. There are, through these disclosures, revelations through the PRISM program, which is the thing that Edward Snowden reveals to exist, which is a mass surveillance instrument that is being used in the war on terror, and still to this day, almost certainly, we don't know exactly the details now, but like we can expect that it carries on. There is mass surveillance in the US. What that does, I think, is produce a sort of general condition under which cynicism or skepticism about state functions can work. But instead of producing a libertarian movement that says, okay, well, we must dismantle the CIA, we must dismantle the FBI, what you get in America is this sort of anti-state feeling being bolstered. And that leads actually, in the American context, with the right libertarianism, to increased faith in people like Trump, who, although they are authoritarians, appear to be anti-authoritarian, right? And so this is kind of complex dialectic of the way in which that revelation is received and absorbed by the American public. And that, in turn, leads to a sort of conspiratorial culture. And so I'm wondering how we avoid or make distinctions between the kinds of rigorous journalistic practice that you are, a proponent of and also a practitioner of, and this sort of wider conspiratorial culture that I think has risen up partly in the wake of the Snowden and WikiLeaks revelations. How to make that distinction?
The conspiracy theories are really devastating and dangerous for our societies, and they do not allow you to understand how power works. You have to investigate and reveal how power actually works, not as conspiracy theories say it works. I don't believe that, if you ask me, I don't believe that Trump want to dismantle this secret power. Quite the opposite. He want to put his own people there.
Of course.
He want to... Yeah. Of course, this is what politicians want to do. They want a change in the sense that they want to put their own people there, But of course, they use this powerful argument that we have to dismantle the CIA, we have to dismantle the secret services, the community, the intelligence community, but it is just a pretext. It's like when Elon Musk says that we should not buy, it is all the stuff to buy, F-35 jet fighters, Lockheed Martin jet fighters, because we are in the age of drones. Sure, but it is not that these people want to dismantle the military-industrial complex. They want to disrupt and to have his own military-industrial complex with these new high-tech companies which replace the old ones. So it is about changing who has access to the big contracts with the Pentagon, with the CIA, with the NSA. They want to put their own companies. They want access to their own contract as contractors. So I don't see any chance that they would dismantle the military-industrial complex or the so-called deep state. They would just replace with another one, with their own.
And the importance of that distinction between the sort of relatively low tech and the very high tech. So, for example, using things like machine learning or AI to analyze documents in the service of intelligence agencies. The really important thing there is that, of course, the weakness of these massive intelligence agencies like the NSA is they have analysts, and the analysts can become whistleblowers. But if you have a machine doing the analysis of documents, if you have a machine doing the processing, the machine is not going to betray the CIA, right? Then whistleblowers become this kind of, almost impossibility, because you have many, many, many fewer people, and therefore you can vet them much more strongly than people like Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning were vetted.
I think you are absolutely right in the sense that these machines have no conscience. They have no conscience like Chelsea Manning. They are soulless killers, The Pentagon had no problem to get killers, but to have soulless killers, they have problems, because at the end of the day, we are humans. So the moment we see a massacre, the moment a Chelsea Manning see a massacre like the one you can see in Collateral Murder, if you have a conscience, if you have a soul, you have an ethical problem. You can decide whether to look the other side or whether not to look the other side. So certainly, I think war will evolve towards a less and less human, way. Whether we will still have whistleblowers, I don't know. It's really hard for me to see what what might happen at the end of the day. But we see that the war is becoming less and less and less human. And these machines are highly problematic, and not just because of the arbitrary and decisions they take, and because there is little transparency about algorithms and so on, and we know nothing about lavender or the artificial intelligence machines killing in Gaza and so on, but also because at the end of the day, these are machines, so they have no ethical problems.
It seems like particularly with the Gaza genocide, there is a shift from a kind of exposure model of journalism to what we might think of as an open source intelligence model, where there is actually an enormous amount of information already out there because people can record things on their phones, or people can give eyewitness testimony because there are people all over Gaza. But it's not pieced together, it's not made coherent. And so when there is an airstrike, it's not clear always what has happened exactly, right? And it's really that point of putting things together that already exists in the public domain that's the important act, rather than bringing something into the public domain by exposing secrets. But maybe we just haven't got to the revelations about the Gaza genocide yet. Do you think that's likely? Do you think there will be whistleblowers from the IDF?
Well, I hope so. I mean, I think the treatment of whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, have been so horrific. So they have paid such a huge price, precisely because the military-industrial complex wants that there won't be another whistleblower about Gaza, about Ukraine. But at the end of the day, we have seen that after Chelsea Manning, and no matter the price paid by Chelsea Manning, we had seen Snowden. So at the end of the day, even if the treatment had been horrific, at the end of the day, he didn't discourage whistleblower, people of conscience, to step out and reveal the truth. So I'm confident. We haven't had so far, we haven't had Chelsea Manning for Ukraine, for Gaza, but I'm hopeful because I have seen the extreme courage of these people.
Thank you so much, Stefania, for talking to us. Please go and buy and read Secret Power. It's a really extraordinary account. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you so much for having me, Richard.
Support independent journalism and set up a regular donation to Novara Media from just £1 a month. Head to novara.media/support. Or face the consequences.